right, welcome to Tip or Not to Tip, a long form conversation series about tipping and all things restaurant. I'm your host, Cassidy Vanderkamp, and today I am joined by Jonathan Meer to talk about minimum wage. Jonathan, thank you so much for being here with me.
Oh, it's a real pleasure to be here.
Yeah, it's lovely to talk to you again. We actually talked a couple years ago as you provided an interview for my film about the tipless restaurant movement in America. And it was so interesting as I was unpacking the story and trying to figure out, okay, what's happening here? Why are restaurants going tip free? It was so clear how impactful minimum wage change was to these individual decisions to move to this kind of unconventional model, at least for Americans. And so I knew that I would need to address it in the film. And yeah, I just loved the way that you talked about minimum wage. It was just really clear and helpful. And so I figured, hey, why not give you space to talk about it a little more in depth and yeah, have a conversation about what has changed since we last talked with minimum wage. But before we get too deep in the conversation, I'd love to give you a chance to introduce yourself. Who are you? What do you do? And how'd you get to where you are?
Sure. So I am the Mary Julia and George R. Jordan Professor of Public Policy in the Texas A&M University Department of Economics, which is just a very long way of saying that I research and teach economics, and I've been doing that for quite a while now. I've been at Texas A&M since 2009. So my research actually mostly focuses on charitable giving, oddly enough, but I got a sort of sideline into minimum wage research about 12 or 13 years ago with my then PhD student, now a tenured professor at the University of California at Santa Cruz, Jeremy West, just a really brilliant guy. And we didn't know much about the minimum wage as researchers, and we kind of went down this rabbit hole and wrote what I think is a very impactful paper on how the minimum wage actually impacts employment in a manner that's a little bit different than the standard models that I teach to over 3,000 undergrads a year in a asynchronous online class on the principles of microeconomics, which I immensely enjoy doing, but where we by necessity have to make simplifying assumptions. So that's kind of taken me down this path, the sideline. I've written a half dozen or so papers on the minimum wage, including most recently one with my good friend and co-author Jeff Clemens, who's at the University of California at San Diego, and another brilliant graduate student, Melissa Gentry, who is focused on the participation of disabled people in day-to-day lives, including employment. And what we find is that large minimum wage changes tend to have a really negative impact on the labor force participation and employment outcomes of severely disabled people.
Mm.
So that's a paper that is going to be published in a peer-reviewed journal very shortly.
Okay, great. And so what drives you to certain topics? I mean, obviously you said your main topic was sort of charitable giving, but what kind of informs you in figuring out what you're going to study in sort of the field of economics? Because there's so many things to focus on and
Well,
dive
that's
deep
absolutely
into.
right. Any young people who are listening, economics is a fantastic field to major in precisely because it's so broad and so methodologically diverse. It's a logical toolkit for solving problems. In my case, the way I like to describe it is, the best part of my job is I get to find the answers to the questions that I want to know the answers to, and I have a tendency to read broadly and get a little bored sometimes. And really, the beauty of being an academic is, if I think a question is important and I want to devote my time to it, that's what I'm going to do a deep dive into and try to do the best job I can in finding the answers to the questions that I want to know the answers to.
So how did you do you remember how you stumbled across the minimum wage questions? Because you kind of said it was sort of a
Yeah, it
sideline
was
thing.
actually quite odd. So Jeremy and I were working actually on a project looking at the impact of health insurance mandates.
Mm,
So this was right around the time of the Affordable Care Act, better known as Obamacare, and so this is around 2011 or so.
hmm.
And there were a lot of mandates in there, meaning that any health insurance that was sold in the United States had to cover this condition, had to cover that condition, et cetera. And it is reasonable people can disagree on whether that is the right thing to do, but there's no question that it's costly. A contract that covers more things is going to be more costly than a contract that covers fewer things. And that money's got to come from somewhere. And Jeremy and I sort of said, like, well, maybe it comes out of employment. Maybe you employ fewer people because now the cost of employing somebody is
Mm.
higher. And so that's actually what we were working on. And Jeremy came into my office one day and said, hey, I just thought that it'd be a good idea to throw the minimum wage as a control variable in this regression as we're looking at the impact of these health insurance mandates on employment. And it's always negative and statistically significant. It seems to always be decreasing employment. And, I always thought, the famous Card-and-Kruger paper from the early 90s on fast food restaurants in New Jersey and Pennsylvania, that, for a lot of people, that was kind of like, well, that's the best we know. And I said, well, I don't know anything about this either beyond, this kind of surface level understanding of the state of the research. And at the time, the minimum wage really was not being studied very much because it had not gone up that much uh, in particularly recent years, but it was around the time that many states were starting to diverge from the federal minimum wage. And
Mhm.
so by the time our paper came out, and this is how academics move in geological time, around 2012, 2013, a year or two later, we're presenting our paper. That was right when you started to get the fight for 15
Mhm.
and legislation moving in that direction. And so we were really lucky in terms of the timing.
Yeah.
If we had sort of done it a couple of years before, we might have not really caught the wave of general interest in the topic. And if we'd been a couple of years later, we would have had a lot more competition, and I don't know that we would have had the impact that we did.
Right. So you bring up sort of the interesting coincidence of like you have this political movement coming out as your research is ready to go. How did that affect the climate of conversation about the topic? And have you seen that change over time as,
Well, so yeah, so
yeah.
Jeremy and I were actually really taken aback because we thought so. Jeremy does a lot of work on crime and environmental topics, and
Mm,
I at the time had a couple papers on the economics of education and a lot of papers on charitable giving. And so, we said we're not partisans in this war because at the time there weren't that many people working on these topics, and they all sort of knew each other and hated each other, and you could set your watch by, if this person's name is on the paper, you kind of know exactly what they're going to find, which is, rarely a good thing.
mhm,
Even when, some of these things are quite reasonable disagreements about the right way to approach the data analysis or the data cleaning. Essentially, what you want to do, what you wish you could do is randomly assign minimum wages to different areas and say, look, the only reason why this place has a higher minimum wage than that place is because we flipped a coin and decided. And so then any differences in the outcomes for low wage workers are the result of this policy change, which was a coin flip. But that's not the way the real world works. And so in reality, we have to accept that the sorts of places that raise the minimum wage are different than the sorts of places that don't. And so you have
mm,
to ask yourself, how do I come up with a good counterfactual, which is just a fancy way of saying what would have happened if the minimum wage hadn't gone up in this place? And
right.
again, reasonable people can really disagree and sometimes disagree vociferously about how best to construct those counterfactuals. And that really is where a lot of the disagreement comes from and why two people, both of whom are really smart, no one is fiddling with anything in an untoward way. They're making reasonable decisions about how to approach the data, and they may come to different conclusions. So Jeremy and I thought, well, we're not partisans. We're just sort of pointing out, hey, um, maybe the minimum wage takes some time to be reflected in the level of employment because the standard models the very standard models basically say, you've got this instantaneous adjustment to a new world. The minimum wage goes up to $15 an hour and the boss goes downstairs and fires five people. But that's not the way the real world works. There's a
Right.
lot of reasons, both theoretical and kind of more psychological, really, of why you would expect that the margin of adjustment is going to be more on uh, changes in the growth rate, replacement of departing workers, and so on. And even, and this is based on some fantastic work by a wonderful young economist, Isaac Sorkin at Stanford, who was writing just a couple of years after us, that there, if you've got a restaurant and your business model is built on a labor-intensive business model, so think like a
Hmm.
McDonald's where you've got a lot of workers manning the cash register, you've got,
Yeah.
a person at the fry station, you got a person making the sandwiches. That's a very labor-intensive model, and you can't flip a switch and say we're going to move to a world of kiosk ordering and one person who's kind of doing everything, and maybe we'll build a $50,000 burger flipping robot. That doesn't happen right away. And so for all of those reasons, Jeremy and I felt quite confident that you would not see this snap to a new equilibrium. And the empirical models, the actual statistical analysis that was being done, the sort of implicit assumption underlying it was that that was the kind of change you were looking for. But if the real world has a slower adjustment and the real world has frequent minimum wage changes, meaning that you don't have a steady control group, you don't
Mm.
have a steady counterfactual, you are actually mechanically going to be much more likely to pick up a zero effect, even when, as we demonstrated with artificial data, with synthetic data, we said, look, we're going to impose an effect on artificial data, and we're going to use the off-the-shelf models to show you that when you run the kinds of models that people have been running for the last 20, 25 years, you will get a zero, even when we know there's a real effect. And so we approached the problem from a different way and found fairly substantial impacts on the low wage, low education, low skill labor market. Um, and it turns out, we had sort of stumbled into a holy war. And the second that we were there, we were surprised at the viciousness with which we were attacked. Now, I will say, look, I'm a big boy, I can take it. But I will say, there are a lot of positives that came out of some of this stuff. Like the final version of our paper was much stronger because we had to deal with a number of people who seem to have made it their mission to kind of tear down our paper. Well, that meant that we had to be really thoughtful about our responses to these things. And that's good science. There's nothing
Yeah.
wrong. I'm not saying no, everyone should have been nice to us and patted us on the head. That's you don't have to be a jerk about it, and I think that it's sort of become it's unfortunate. Um, but it has been kind of interesting to see how it's played out. And I should say there are really good economists who I disagree with on this stuff, who I will cheerfully have a beer with at conferences, and we'll chat and we'll have a good time. And we know that we don't agree on this stuff, but we're not jerks about it. And there are other people who I will not have a beer with because they're jerks. And it really is more. I mean, but that's true everywhere.
True.
So yeah, it is. The Princeton economist Tim Leonard wrote a fantastic essay in 2000 that is still very much rings true today, which was called something like the modern minimum wage debates and their antecedents, or something like that. And he's a phenomenal writer. And he sort of points out, is like the minimum wage has never been a particularly important policy. It affects 2 or 3% of the labor market. Um, and so why is it the subject of so much vitriol and an angry debate? And you can go back to 1912 and find famous economists who passed away 100 years ago having pretty much the same debates that we're having today in they wrote better than we do, in terms of the articulation of their words, but it's very much the same debates with often the same level of dispute. um, why is it? And Leonard sort of says, like, look, it seems like the very soul of economics is at stake. And those are his words. They're better words than I could have come up with. It's kind of the heart of economics, which is that demand curves slope down. The more expensive something is, the less of it you want to buy. And so if you can just say, well, no, it doesn't apply, are you saying, you know, economics is just it's a just so story, and you can sort of craft your own policy. And in my unkinder moments, and I am borrowing this phrase from someone else, and I wish I could remember who, so I could attribute it to them, but it's policy-based evidence making. Which is, so as opposed to
Mm,
evidence-based policy making, this is
right.
policy-based evidence making. And there are some people, including some reasonably prominent people, who I would say practice policy-based evidence making. They are
Hmm.
advocates for this position, and they will never in a million years publish a paper where they don't find that the minimum wage has, at worst, no effect on the labor market.
Mm. Yeah, it's just so much in there that, but it brings me to sort of interesting questions of one, as a researcher, how do you kind of get to that place where you're putting yourself in that right order where it's not letting your sort of perception of what it should be drive what your results are. And I think the second question is how have you learned to be charitable in these conversations with people who are equally equally talented in their research but have these different disagreements? How have you been able to manage those two things? Because I think outside of the realities of the answer to these questions, those I think tend to be the harder questions that people kind of struggle with, and coming up with the stories that we see in the world and how we live them out, if that makes any
Well, so
sense.
let me start with the second question, which is, how do you take a charitable view? Which I think I mean, it's just like any interaction with people. If someone's a huge jerk, then it's sort of hard to take a charitable view of their intentions. And if someone just says, "Hey, I wouldn't have set up the regression in this exact way, and I think that this particular control may be picking up too much of the variation, and that's why you're finding the thing you find." And I say, I take your point. Here's why I disagree. And that's an academic disagreement. And if you can't have that kind of disagreement, well, then you get the sort of discourse that we have in today's modern politics. And
Right.
and I think that we should all work really hard to not fall into those traps.
Yeah.
In terms of disciplining yourself, I think this is one of the reasons why it's valuable to have co-authors with maybe a different perspective, slightly different perspective, or a different skill set than you. I really admire
Mm.
people who do what are they called? It's not a conflict collaboration, but it's some like neat alliteration thing where like two people who disagree work on a project together.
Mm.
I don't know that my anxiety levels could handle that, but I am just filled with admiration for the people who do that. So, you
Mm.
try to find lighter versions of that where, you've got co-authors who are honest and will keep you honest. And again, this is not about fraud. And I think that's a really important point for the most part. Of course, there is academic fraud out there. This is what the great statistician at Columbia, Andrew Gelman, calls the Garden of Forking Paths, which is based off of a Jorge Luis Borges story from the 1940s, which is just that you can make reasonable choices, and we all have to make dozens of reasonable choices. Hey, here's something that might be a data error because for 1 year, employment in this particular industry in this particular state seems to have been 40% higher than it should have been. What do you do with that observation? You're almost positive it's wrong, or that either there was something incredibly weird going on, or somebody fat fingered something, or there just stuff happens, right? Things are not perfect. So how do you treat that observation? Reasonable people can disagree. How do you decide how to measure employment? Do you measure it in just the number? Do you take a logarithm? Or what do you do? And there's standard things, but there's also reasonable differences of opinion. And we are being human. We will generally make a choice that kind of maybe slightly favors the story that we slightly prefer. We may
Hmm.
even tell ourselves, well, the results are sharper when I do it this way, which means that's probably the right way to do it. Well, maybe. Uh, and if you make 2 dozen of those choices, and this is Gelman's Garden of Forking Paths, you can end up in a really different place. And there's been a couple, I think there's been two of these, and I just think they're great. And the authors who did them, I can't imagine the amount of effort, which is to get teams of fairly prominent people, and you give them the same data set and the same basic question, and they work independently, and you get like 30 teams, and then the authors of the paper sort of take it all, And literally nobody comes up with the same answer in terms of the same actual number. And the counts of observations, like the choices that are made about the data, this is an illustration of all of the forking paths. And so it's really difficult. So one of the things that I think we economists do well, at the cost of much longer lag times in publications and very long appendices, is you do it all the ways and show that you're getting fairly consistent results. And you can say, look, these are my quote unquote preferred estimates for the following reasons. But in Appendix F, you can find the 7 other ways that I tried it, and you can go see for yourself that, you know, maybe the effect is a little bit smaller, but it's still in the same direction that I, sort of said. And so, I did it 20 different ways and they're all fairly consistent. Maybe it's not surprising you do something 20 ways, one of them kind of goes the other direction. It's sort of just
Right.
statistical probabilities. But that's kind of the approach. And I think that's good empirical academic work, is to be very, hands above the table. Let me show you everything I've done. And that's again what the peer review process is for, is to say, well, it's not to say I want to see it 700 other ways, but it's to say, look, you made this choice and it's not an unreasonable choice. Here's another reasonable choice. How different are the results if you do it
Right.
that way?
Right.
And when the author comes back to me as the anonymous reviewer on this and says, look, we did it and it's basically the same, I'm like, okay, it's your paper, not mine. I would have done it in the alternative way, but the fact that it's very similar answer. Now, if the numbers are flying around, depending on the choices that you make, that's suggestive that it's probably mostly noise. And, you maybe put your thumb on the scale, is maybe makes it sound a little too fraudulent, but it really was, well, my preferred specification is the one that fits my pre-existing viewpoints. But you
Hmm.
have to discipline yourself, and you have to do this because you want to know the answer, not because you're a policy advocate.
Right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So, yeah, I guess it's a good way to sort of pivot and say, what have you, through your research on minimum wage, learned, and sort of where has that left you in sort of the sense of a policymaking perspective on minimum wage choices?
So what I have found is small minimum wage increases do not tend to have large effects on employment. In large part because employers have a lot of levers they can pull. There's a lot of things that an employer will do before they reduce their labor headcount. And that's been the subject of a couple of papers, by myself and Jeff Clemens, who I mentioned earlier, and our friend and co-author Lisa Kahn, who is at the University of Rochester. And so, you know, part of that can mean hiring a different set of people. So, if you have to pay people 15 or 18, or, in Seattle now, $21 an hour, you may not be super interested in hiring a 16-year-old or someone with a felony conviction on their record, or a single mom who says, "Hey, every Tuesday I have to kind of leave 20 minutes early because I have to get my kid from daycare." Say, "Well, I've got a line of people outside, who want this job. I'm going to take the clean cut college kid who comes up in his BMW, And so you can imagine that there is, and we document that there is a shift in terms of who people hire. There are shifts in terms of the composition of employment, and if I'm going to set you up nicely with a segue, there may be a lot of interactions particularly for tipped employees, in terms of how their total compensation changes when you start thinking about the tips. So that's sort of, but then I will say, large minimum wage changes of the sorts that we've seen in many states and cities in the last half decade or so, do have an impact on employment, especially for young people, and people with low levels of education, and people who, like I mentioned at the start, who may be marginally attached to the labor force, like the disabled,
Hmm.
tends to have pretty substantial impacts on them, in large part because that is where the the levers, you've run out of levers. You know, if you have to pay people $21 an hour, there's not a lot you can do in terms of other things, especially when, and this is one of the reasons why it's difficult, you know, places like Seattle often bundle these laws with things like, you know, no split shifts. So you can't have someone
Mm,
cover 4 hours at lunch and then go home and cover 4 hours at dinner, where, you know, you're paying them $21 an hour to man the restaurant at, you know, 3:30 p.m. when there's literally nobody there. So, you know, things like 2 weeks advance notice for schedule changes, things like that really tie employers' hands in terms of being able to shift employment, which is why Seattle's employment of restaurant workers is, I believe that this is still true. I haven't checked in a few months, is below where it was prior to COVID.
mm.
You know, now some of that, of course, is COVID and COVID hangover, but it doesn't help when the minimum wage has gone up, you know, $3 during that time period.
Right. Yeah, that was something that I was discovering too. Outside of just the strict numbers, there's all of these sort of bylaws written into these laws as ways to protect certain types of workers. Yet it sort of ties a lot of uh, restaurant owners' hands on what they can do to pay the different types of employees, and you don't think about that.
Well,
We
I
don't.
do. It's my
Well,
job.
yeah, but I think just a regular voter doesn't necessarily think about that when they're presented with these sort of laws, sort of in a surface level way or sort of a political way. Um, and
And they
yeah,
are well intentioned. You know,
yeah,
that's the thing is, you know, this having, you know, having uneven schedules or schedules that change rapidly is really hard on
yeah,
people. And so, you know, this is the sort of natural inclination to do something, you know, capital D, capital S, do something. But there are trade-offs, right? So, you know,
yeah.
we economists say no solutions, only trade-offs. And again, reasonable people can disagree. Um, what we should be able to agree on, though, you know, as we were just discussing, this is where the difficulty of doing good empirical work comes in, is here is the trade-off, which is that if you tie employers' hands in this way, they say, you know, look, I will just have one fewer staff person on the restaurant floor, you know, and if it's super busy, you know, then when you and I go out to dinner, um, we have a longer wait, you know, and we have and but there, so the customers bear some of the cost. And I don't even mean through higher prices. That's a separate issue. I mean, they bear part of the cost through a less good experience. You know, if your water is sitting there empty, if your food comes out cold because the wait person, the server has, you know, is managing 50% more tables than they should be, you have a worse experience. And the question becomes, um, do you go back to that restaurant? Do you go out to eat less? Because it's a less good experience. And the place where I often draw this is, you know, there's a New York Times article some years ago, I think this was even pre-pandemic, about a new segment of dining in San Francisco. And it was the title of the article was something like San Francisco restaurants can't find waiters, so they're putting customers to work. And so these were places that had, you know, sit down menu prices and sit down menu style food, you know, $30 entrees,
Hmm.
$35 entrees, $15 glasses of wine, but you were ordering at the counter.
Yeah.
And so, you know, what sometimes I would say this and I would sort of preface it like, look, people, oh, are you too good to bust your tray? And I'm like, no, I'm not too good to bust my tray. But one, that used to be somebody's job. So somebody used to have that job and now they don't. And
Hmm.
two, like if I was out on a date, and frankly, you know, even if my wife of almost 16 years, you know, one of the reasons that we go out is so that we can sit and have a conversation. And if we're standing in line and QR, don't get me started on the QR codes. Now I feel like an old man yelling at the cloud. But if we're squinting at our phones while we're standing in line and feeling rushed because we're about to step up to the counter and then being like, well, do I want this? And now I've got my number and do I have to come back up to the counter to get my food? It is not the experience that I want when, you know, we leave the kids at home and we have our own time. And so are we less likely to go out? Probably.
Hmm.
Doesn't mean we don't go out at all, but we, you know, if people go out 5% less often, that is 5% less revenue for those restaurants. And
Hmm.
if you know anything about restaurant profit margins, that is probably the difference for a non-trivial number of restaurants between staying open and closing.
Yeah.
And so thinking through these effects beyond just dollars, beyond just the employee headcount or menu costs, but all the way through is what separates good economists from mediocre economists or people who don't think through this way. And this is the kind of logical thought process that I try to imbue in my mostly freshmen in my principles classes. This is what economics gives you, is this ability to say, well, what does this do to the quality of service? And then what does that quality of service do to my desire to eat out? And then if I'm eating out less, what does that do to, the demand for restaurant meals? And then what does that do to the number of people you need to prepare and serve those restaurant meals?
Right. What would you say has been the most surprising thing that you learned from your research? Like, what is the thing that you found and were sort of I don't know, taken aback by it or something?
I actually think the size of employment effects of the minimum wage on marginal groups. On by marginal groups, I mean groups that are marginally attached to the labor force. So you're thinking like teenagers, people without high school diplomas, the disabled. They are bigger than I thought they would be.
Mm,
The effects on most people, including like adults with high school degrees in low wage jobs, is not very big. Um, and again, many of those people are getting more dollars in their pocket. Some of that may be getting clawed back in terms of some of the ways that employers can say, well, I used to be willing to let you show up 10 minutes late, and now, you're getting written up and I'm going to dock your pay if you show up late, and we're going to be a lot stricter about the way we do this, or I expect you to work a lot harder, because hey, if I'm paying you $21 an hour, there's no sitting around. Like,
yeah.
go walk the floor and make sure everything is in place. So some of that wage increase may be getting clawed back, but certainly not all of it. And so again, no solutions, only trade-offs. There are more dollars in some people's pockets. There are way fewer dollars in other people's pockets. And now we're into where I fall on the policy spectrum, which is don't mess with prices to transfer income. The minimum wage is a blunt instrument. It does not differentiate between my 14-year-old son looking for his first job to earn some money to pay for video games and a single mom of three kids, or a recently paroled felon,
Hmm.
or someone who is just picking up some work on the side. It treats all those
Yeah.
people the same. And it treats people who live in high income households, like my son, the same as, again, that single mom of three who's really struggling to get by. If you want low income households to have resources, transfer those resources to them. And that, I think, sort of shines a light on why the minimum wage is popular policy politically. One is it fits on a bumper sticker, right?
Hmm.
Fight for 15. And two, it seems like, again, the capital D, capital S do something. Here are some people who don't have a lot of money and they have hard lives and they work in hard jobs. And so let's tell employers to give them more money. Well, my first counter would be, well, the employer's given them a job that they voluntarily took. So what more does the employer owe them? And does this suggest that the employer should pay the single mom of three kids more than the married mom of one kid? Or, someone who doesn't have dependents, should they be paid less? Should employers set wages as a function of people's need? And, that should raise at least some people's hackles. The government should absolutely transfer resources based on people's needs. That's what we have a tax and transfer system for. So, my world would say, let the market set wages. The minimum wage in Texas is 7.25 an hour still. I don't think anyone other than people who are tipped are paid 7.25 or less. That is, even in College Station, Texas, the prevailing wage is significantly above 7.25,
Mm,
even for, freshmen who have a job to, make money on the side. Um,
mm.
and so college students and even high school students. So uh, let's let the market set wages. The prevailing wage in Seattle may very well be 17 or $18 an hour. And then if you are worried that that proverbial single mom does not have enough resources, then let's give her money and let's get that money by taxing high income people like me and transferring the resources that way. But that is a much
Mm.
more difficult sell for a politician than let's make those greedy fat cats pay their fair share. You know,
Right.
it's a glib. It is hashtag slacktivism. It is the glib thing to say. The hard thing to say is the choice that says, we're going to prioritize these kinds of transfers, which we already do in a large part between the earned income tax credit and the child tax credit. We are transferring really substantial sums of money to low income people with dependents. Um, this is sort of one of these things that comes as a surprise often to people who think that we're like incredibly stingy. The maximum EITC for someone with three dependents, I think, is over $7,000 at this point. And then you would add the refundable child tax credit to that. And so, for a low income single parent with three children, you are probably transferring something like ten or $12,000 to them in transfer programs, and maybe that number should be bigger. I don't know. But it's not like no money is going through them. But the tax and transfer system is the right way to have something that's fair and treats people equally based on their needs, which is what the transfer system is for. Whereas the wages should be based on those people's productivity in the labor force.
Yeah. I think, yeah, in the film, and I'm paraphrasing here, I think you said something like minimum wage being a really bad anti poverty policy, and we should focus on different ways to alleviate poverty instead of just heightening that number of like what you minimally can be paid. Um, I just found that really striking and interesting. And yeah, I just wondered for you, you kind of touched on it a little bit, but what is that what is that better way to alleviate poverty, and how do we talk about it where not that it's catchy, but that it resonates with people? Because I think that's the problem with a lot of these conversations of the story of minimum wage, of helping the most disadvantaged, lowest paid workers in our society is really powerful, except that, as you said, there's these sort of unintended consequences and complications with how that plays out.
Well, so we have a structure in place, which is the earned income tax credit. And so the earned income tax credit is a wage subsidy. So if you have labor income and you have children, so if you don't have any dependents, you're practically ineligible for the earned income tax credit. And that's something that at the time Speaker Ryan and President Obama both supported increasing the earned income tax credit for childless people, which I guess that meant that there were no political points to be scored, so it just never went anywhere. There was a 1 year expansion of it during COVID, but it was temporary, and then it went away. Um, but we do have a framework for it. Now, we could and should deliver this in a better way. We also have the framework to deliver it in a better way, because right now we do all of this through the tax code. And this is one of the things, again, when well-meaning but sort of naive people compare our system to Europe's system. They say, look how much Europe spends on social services. And that's because Europe does a lot of direct spending on social services, European
Mm.
countries, whereas the United States does a lot of its social service spending at the federal level through the tax code.
Mm.
And so what appears to be negative tax payments to 25% of households are in fact the equivalent of, well, supplements for when you're low income and you have children. So we have a refundable child tax credit. We have a whole bunch of overlapping programs, and we have this earned income tax credit. I would want to unify a lot of our transfer programs, because the trouble here is, of course, you don't want Bill Gates to be getting the earned income tax credit or a variety of supplements. So you've got to phase them out, which means that for every dollar you earn, you lose about 21 cents of your earned income tax credit. But that's a tax, right? So you earn one more dollar, which is great. You lose 21 cents of your earned income tax credit. That is exactly the same thing as having a 21% tax on those earnings.
Hmm.
And high marginal tax rates, that is the tax on the next dollar that you earn, will reduce your work effort because it is now less valuable for you to work. We call this the substitution effect. So the problem is that we have a lot of programs and a lot of them overlap. And
Right.
so depending on how much you earn and what your family situation is, you could get a raise at work because you worked really hard and you earn $500 more per year. But the combination of losing 21 cents of earned income tax credit, 15 cents of the refundable child tax credit, 30 cents of SNAP, of food stamps, could add up for certain sections to actually greater than 100%. And
Hmm.
so you could get $500 for working really hard and find that you've lost your subsidized housing. And so you now owe an extra $200 a month in rent. And so you actually made negative $700 for getting this raise. If you set out to design a system to keep people in poverty, while appearing generous, it would look a lot like that. And again, I don't
Hmm.
think anyone did this deliberately, but if we were to unify these things and treat our fellow citizens with the dignity to say, I will give you this money, and if what you need it for is to fix your car because you live with a friend and so you don't need rent money, you need car money, or you need money for your kids' childcare, versus, someone else, they're having their parent watch the kids. So they don't need the money for that. They need the money for gas to get to work. Whatever it is, knowing that some people are going to misuse the money, especially in a country of 340 million people, there's going to be your proverbial, Reagan's welfare queen driving a Cadillac. That's going to happen. But the vast majority of people just want a better life for themselves and their kids. And
Yeah.
so the way we would equip them to do that, it would be to supplement their work effort and to preserve the incentives, or rather to preserve the incentives for them to work, and on the flip side, bringing this back to the minimum wage, for employers to employ them.
Hmm. Yeah. Great. Well, yeah. Speaking of tax, it brings me to a question that I don't know exactly if you have a lot of thoughts on that, but there has been
I
um,
probably do.
there has been some conversation floating around about making tips tax free. Yeah. What do you think the impact of that would be?
Well, so I have many thoughts. Let's actually start with the politics of it. So this was I think I'm trying to remember whether it was President Trump or then Vice President Harris who first proposed it, but it was clearly a sop to, because Nevada was sort of an in-play state, and Nevada's got a really big service sector, and they've
Yeah.
got a big service sector union, and whoever went first, and I'm pretty sure it was President Trump. Said like no tax on tips, and he said it at like a union rally, and then Vice President Harris followed on like 2 days later. And so is this like nakedly political vote buying, like, which leads me into the tax theory of it. And I promise this won't turn into a public economics lecture, but it basically violates every possible tenet of optimal taxation. So you would be treating two people who earn exactly the same amount, possibly for very similar jobs, the tax code would be treating them very differently. So someone who is a cashier at Target who earns $35,000 a year would have a significantly higher tax bill than someone who works a counter service job where they do get tipped. And so that violates what we call horizontal equity, which means that people in similar situations should be treated similarly by the tax code. So huge strike number one. Now we get into the distortions that you create. Well, now that's going to shift more people to want to work in tipped professions. So we'll work through the economics of this. That means the supply of labor in those professions increases, which means the wages you have to pay people in order to work in those professions falls somewhat. So, okay, the minimum wage may put a floor on whether employers can sort of lower the prevailing wage for those workers. But employers are going to get part of what we call the economic incidence, which is just a fancy way of saying they get some of the benefit of this because they're maybe now able to pay workers somewhat less than they were before because they're like, look, half of your income is not being taxed, so you're still making out okay. We're going to kind of split. We'll split the proceeds of this. So that's sort of behavioral response number one. Behavioral response number two that you can easily think of is like, I don't know how I would like to find out how I can reclassify as much of my salary as possible into tips, right? And so, now you're going to have the IRS playing whack-a-mole with people trying to say, well, that the a tip by definition has to be voluntarily given. That's like the tax definition of a tip. And well, what does voluntarily given mean? Well, when there's a service charge on there, that's no longer, is that still a tip? For legal, and I just mean legally. I'm not even talking philosophically. I'm happy to talk about the philosophy of tipping with you too. But it is just the worst sort of policymaking. And of course, it's wildly popular precisely because people don't like taxes, and they're this is why nobody likes economists, because we have to be the designated driver that says like, no, you've had too much. I'm taking the wheel. But no one lets us take the wheel anymore, which is how we've gotten to, I don't know when this will come out, but we're in sort of late April right now, and so it's the last 2.5 weeks or so have been an object lesson in what happens when you never learn the principles of economics.
Do you want to go more specifically into that?
I mean, we should get together again and
Yeah.
and talk about tariffs, but
Yeah.
but we can stick to tipping
Six
right
to
now.
tipping. Yeah. No, it's interesting. I mean, I hear it and I think it's a disaster for a bunch of other reasons outside of the economic ones. But it's interesting to hear your perspective of also
Well, I'd
thinking
love to,
it's
because I'm only thinking about that. This is, all I have is a hammer, so everything looks like a nail. So I'd love to hear what the sort of less economics focused counter arguments are.
yeah, well, and you kind of have to have a sort of more tip-free mindset, right? So for people who are more in the position to prefer tips, it sounds great, right? But for me, I think tipping it creates such a dysfunctional dynamic within a restaurant system for workers and business owners. And I think to go to a tip-free model is creating a more sustainable working environment, not only for the business owners, but for the employees as well. And then, how do you navigate that with all of these weird tipping laws that already exist within minimum wage laws, where tip splitting is not possible in many states, where if you don't have direct connection with a server or with a customer, you can't receive a tip. So you have these servers who are the ones making minimum wage, but also making tips, getting all of this money and not being able to spread that out to other people who have also helped within the service, such as, dishwashers, cooks, all the way down the line. And so there becomes this sort of economic like class system within a restaurant that makes it hard. Like there's an emotional aspect that makes it hard for people to work together. And
Well, I would say actually, I mean, I shouldn't have used the example of the Target cashier, but to stick with your example of the inequities within the restaurant, the dishwasher and the busboy may make the exact same number of dollars, and now the dishwasher is going to pay more in tax. And
yeah,
and that I think is probably a more direct view of the horizontal inequity. I want to ask you. I love
yeah,
asking you questions, but I'm gonna turn the tables on you just a little bit.
yeah.
So we've got there's a number of places around the world that don't have tipping, and tipping is not expected. And
Yeah.
I was so I'm sort of thinking like Southern Europe, where I recently visited with my daughter, and Japan, where I recently visited with my son. And
Hmm.
so both of these cultures have no real expectation of tipping.
Yep.
Uh, they have wildly different levels of customer service.
Yes.
And so I suspect, and this is sort of armchair anthropology, I think that in a counterfactual world where we don't have tipping in the US, our service quality is more likely to be like that of Spain or Italy, where the people are wonderful, but you will not see your waiter unless you like tackle them across the knees to get their attention, rather than the service levels that you see in East Asian countries, where the service is incredibly attentive and professional without any expectation of a gratuity.
Yeah.
And so, I guess, to what extent do you think that people's beliefs about what customer service in a tip-free world looks like is colored by their views of whether we look like a French cafe where the waiter will slap you for daring to ask for more water versus a Japanese place where they can seem to literally read your mind and meet your needs, even at the sort of most hole-in-the-wall restaurants in a small town?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question, and it's funny. I actually live in the Netherlands now, and I feel that service difference very starkly. Where yeah, you order your drink, and then yeah, you forget seeing the server for the rest of the time you're there, and it's really interesting. I don't know whether it is. I don't, and I can't know for sure, right? But my inclination is that it is less the tipping aspect, but more of a cultural aspect. So, for example, like the Dutch, it doesn't it doesn't bother them not to see their server. Like to them, they don't want to see their server. That's like get out of here. But Americans, we have that expectation of having that service there and continuous and fast and just fast paced. It's just a different culture. Because if it was just the tipping, then wouldn't you see similar outcomes in service in Asian countries where tipping is very heavily discouraged versus sort of European countries where it's not expected, but you can still tip and leave a couple dollars. Like it wouldn't be outside the realm to leave a couple dollars if you have a meal or something. So it's interesting to kind of think about what would the cultural shift be for Americans, because we are very into hospitality. We are very sort of quick and fast paced. I think it would take a long time to get that outside of service. And the other thing is Americans are very work driven. So even without that sort of tip incentive, I do think there's something in the American culture that would still prioritize that kind of service. But you don't know how it would change over time, and it's really interesting. I think it's less of a pay incentive question and more of a cultural question. And
Mhm.
yeah, I am interested to see what would change. But I've worked
So
in
the economist in me compels me to jump in and say,
yeah.
you say and I do think we economists ignore culture at our peril. But that said, um, the incentives, it's still incentives when it's culture,
Mm,
because
yes.
violating social norms is really damaging. And people think
Yeah.
economics is dollars and cents, but economics is about feeling, right? Like this is why, why do we leave a tip in a place where we'll never go back to again?
Yeah.
We like you'll never see this server again. You'll never be in this town again. Why are you tipping? And why are you tipping after the meal, right? And
Hmm.
so from a pure dollars and cents perspective, it makes no sense whatsoever. But when the social norm is, we tip X amount in this place, or the social norm is we work really hard because that's what we do for our customers, then violating the social
Yeah.
norm is damaging to ourselves, and we
Yeah.
feel bad about breaking that social norm. And so it is an incentive. It's an incentive not to feel like a jerk.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I think it's an interesting counterpoint. But what I do think is true about the culture in America is that sense of tip fatigue, where people are tired of always being prompted
Everywhere.
for a tip. Yeah, I
What's
have
the silliest example you have?
a plumber.
A plumber. Oh wow. That's really something. I have a friend who sent me a screenshot of a shoe online shoe company where he was invited to add a tip for their workers purchasing shoes online.
Yeah, no, it's getting pretty insane, and I think it would only increase if all of a sudden now tax or tip free. All of a sudden, everybody's gonna want a tip because
Yeah,
that's
I
a
do. I mean, my students, I teach 3,000 students a year. You know,
of a
if they
jar.
each put 20 bucks, I mean, that's a good chunk of change right there.
Yeah,
Tax free, buy a new car every year if I want to. No,
yeah,
and again, it's absurd, and I think it's damaging. I think it can be really damaging to professional relationships, and yet I feel that tug sometimes when I will have an HVAC guy who is just like gone above and beyond, you know? And I'm like, why does this guy not get a tip? And yet, you know, there's this strange stuff. And then there's also, you know, these kind of strange norms that I think a lot of people aren't familiar with, where you don't tip the owner, right? That the expectation is you don't tip the owner. And you know, so like if you say go to a massage therapist or someone and you're the oh it's an owner operator kind of thing and they have a tip jar out, you're like, well, but I'm paying you directly, and this is not about like, oh, well, the owner gets the X number of dollars and you get 30% of the X number of dollars. It's like, look, if you want more of my dollars, raise your price.
yeah,
But you still kind of feel that tug because, as you said, I mean, there's tip fatigue, but there's this big social pressure, which I'm gonna close the loop here. You know, I have studied social pressure in the context of charitable giving, you know, where it really is like if it's someone standing next to you being like, well, how much would you like to give to this really important cause? And especially if you know that person, it's a very different feeling than, you know, do you want to click here to round up, you know, on your checkout of not even supermarket checkout, but on the checkout of you know some online store where it's like, you know, round up and give to charity. There's no social pressure there, and it has a huge effect on people's behavior.
yeah. Well, and I think that sort of sense of the professional pressures that affect things, you feel it when you're working in a restaurant system, especially working in tipped systems. And this is why I actually prefer tip-free restaurant systems above anything else. Is just the sort of camaraderie and the sense of like community and building towards something that you get versus when you're just working for tips, you're kind of just looking out for yourself.
Yeah.
And
Well, I
you
can tell you,
might still
it gets worse. It can get worse. So when I was in college, I was a bartender at the Nassau Inn, the Yankee Doodle Tap Room, the Nassau Inn in Princeton, New Jersey. And we were, I worked, I didn't work very much, but I worked there, and it was a really strange setup that where that feeling was palpable. So apparently, the union agreement had been that the bartenders' wages would be higher. So I was getting paid $8 an hour. And this is, you know, 2001. So that would be like 13 or $14 today. But we did not pool tips with the wait staff. And this was a bar with a big restaurant. And very often there would be business dinners or graduation dinners, and, you know, hundreds of dollars of the bill
beer,
were
wine.
drinks,
Yeah.
and the wait staff would pocket those tips. And so if the bar was busy and the restaurant was busy, of course I prioritized the people who were in front of me. That's where my incentives were. And every now the manager would be like, you can't ignore the other ones. I'm like, I'm not ignoring them. I'm just prioritizing the people who are directly in front of me. And, you know, there's an easy solution if you want me to prioritize this, you know, like, you know, we'll pull. But it was corrosive in the sense that the wait staff would be like, "Hey, I need these glasses of wine, or I need this martini or whatever." I'd be like, I promise I will get to it after I'm done with the people who are actually paying me directly."
Yeah. Well,
So
and
it can get even worse.
I think that's where it gets tricky for business owners when you're sort of putting sort of the bill to pay your employees on the customers and not taking that on yourself. They don't have security in you and your business that you're going to take care of them. And they're very much more likely to go to wherever the check average is higher instead of building something with you. And I just think it creates really unstable environments to grow something really, really interesting and beautiful. Because I think so many restaurants can be really interesting and beautiful and create these opportunities to grow within a restaurant. But the system now is not incentivized for that, and I think it's more of a detriment than a help. But anyways, that was most of my questions. Is there anything else that you wanted to ask or anything you wanted to add before we close off?
Well, I will say if any either budding economists or we have very little research on tipping. I've always wanted to write a paper with it and talk to some friends and colleagues. There's a handful of good papers on this. Kwabena Donker, who's a professor at Stanford's Graduate School of Business and a former taxi driver himself, was able to get data from New York City taxis where there are different default menus for tips, and was able to use that to actually calculate the mental cost of tipping. Like, to what degree do the defaults matter? But because so many tips are either not reported or made in cash, there's just very little systematic research on it, and unfortunately, I think that's probably likely to stay that way precisely because it's not a great environment. But I think that it's an area that's really fertile for a lot of research, not just on, hey, what's actually going on, but from a fundamental human behavior perspective. Why do people leave tips? Why do they leave the tips they do? What changes under different policy regimes? What changes when the minimum wage goes up? Because the deal was Seattle's minimum wage is $21. I'm ordering with a QR code and the bartender hands me a plastic cup of beer. Well, compostable. It's Seattle. Why am I being prompted to tip $3 on a $14 beer when I know that the bartender is making $21 an hour? So did the quote unquote living why didn't the quote unquote living wage movement in these very high minimum wage places kind of kill off tipping? And I don't know the answers. Like I said, my job is to find the answers to the questions I want to know the answers to, but I haven't been able to figure out a good way to get this one in there.
Yeah. Well, if I had to guess, I would say there's probably a lot less cultural unity on tip expectation than we think.
Yeah, that's probably accurate.
Just from experience, you think, oh, everybody knows what to tip, and it's like, no, we don't have an agreement on that. So it's interesting, but I would be really fascinated to learn more about that. I just find the whole thing fascinating. But
obviously.
Yeah, obviously. Well, thank you, Jonathan. I really appreciate you taking your time with this, and again, always so lovely to chat with you.
Yeah, Cassie, it's always great to see you.
Hey guys, Cassidy here. Thank you so much for making it to the end of this podcast. I am amazed. That's truly a feat in this day and age, so I appreciate you for tuning in. For those of you who don't know, Tip or Not to Tip is a podcast series that I am releasing in conjunction with the public release of my film, Tipless, which is a feature documentary that explores the tip-free restaurant movement in America. We premiered the film in 2021, but we're finally releasing the film completely for free to help kickstart what I think is a super important conversation. So if you'd like to check out the film that started this all, I've included a link in the description where you can watch it. It was very much a labor of love to make, so it means a lot personally that anyone wants to take the time and view it. So thank you for watching. Alongside that, we've also provided a link where individuals can contribute monetarily to this project. There's obviously no obligation to contribute, but I know that there might be people out there who like this conversation, want to see it continue, and want to help us to continue facilitating this conversation. So I'm giving people the opportunity to do so. These contributions not only fuel our past efforts, but they're also fueling our future endeavors to figure out ways how we keep this conversation going and in a more productive way. So I sort of think of it this way. You're getting the meal for free. If you like it, you want to show your appreciation, I'm not above accepting a tip. Outside of that, if you want to keep up to date with future episodes, make sure to subscribe, hit the bell, all that jazz. And if you have any suggestions of topics we should cover or people we should talk to, please just leave a comment below or connect with us at tiplessfilm.com.